Good morning, everybody. I am really excited to be chatting with all of you today. I think we're going to have an incredible next 45 minutes here to an hour. We've got a few people that are still signing in here, so we're going to get started in just a moment. But first off, for those that don't know me personally, my name is Jonathon Hensley. I'm the author of Alignment, and super excited to share this launch event with all of you today. As we get going here, I'd also like to introduce you to Dave Jarecki, who co-wrote the book with me and was a huge part of bringing this book to fruition. Dave, say hello to everybody.
Hey everyone, I'm glad to be here, and yeah, no, this is a great moment. Jonathon, it was a privilege working with you on this book. We went through a few. Not only did we go through a few iterations, but I think the world went through a few iterations since we started back in December of 2018. So it's good to be here today.
Oh God, nobody could have ever imagined the 2 years of this writing process would be like, let alone what's happening in the world around us. It's unbelievable. But we're here, we're launching a book, and it's exciting. And I think the book has turned out incredible in a huge part to all the people that participated in the process. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. A couple logistics just to take care of. We're going to do a Q&A with Chris Cravens, our featured guest here, in just a little bit. If you have questions for myself or Chris, please enter them into the questions box there on your screen, and we'll make sure that we get to those later on this morning. And with that, looks like we've got most attendees. We've got people, wow, from looks like all over. We've got people from London, East Coast, San Francisco. Looks like we've got great representation coming in from all over the place. So this is exciting. So Dave, where should we start today, huh?
Well, I was thinking about, I was remembering the first time you and I met. And that was, I was invited to lunch by a fellow that you work with, John Lucas. And he just said, hey, the owner of our company has a book he wants to write. And we met down at Henry's in Pearl, which I think Henry's may have been shuttered since this,
they didn't make it.
And so that's a whole other fascinating angle to the story. But I wanted to ask you, do you remember the book you had in mind when we first sat down? And I think that you were, if I recall, you definitely had some 1,000 words. You had maybe like 10 to 20,000 words that you had already dedicated to it. There had been a previous iteration you were working on. But what were you? Tell me a little bit of what you recall from that iteration from December of 2018.
Sure. Well, the book actually started as something completely different than what it became. I mean, originally the book was going to be all about this idea of friction, the friction that organizations deal with in, creating and delivering and then maintaining great products and services. And, as we went through that process of writing it in interviewing people and getting people's incredible insights and shared experiences about, how you deal with the friction in your organization and dealing with that as a leader of an organization from the C-suite down to product management level, and just getting started in your career even, that, an entirely different theme started to kind of rise to the surface. And it was really interesting. Friction was part of the story, but it wasn't really the story that needed to be told. So we ended up scrapping about, I think, 2/3 of that original concept, and we had to pivot, and it became something completely different, which is now Alignment.
Yeah, that's. I remember when I left the meeting, my first thought was, that guy's way smart, and I have no idea what any of that is. Like that's one of the joys of a writer's life, is to be able to immerse and really learn. And so I had to be working with you. I had to bring in that sort of the writing view, but I really had to be a student of the process. And I have a question about that, but I think maybe it'd be good if Chris comes in, and then I could ask both of you the question I'm thinking of.
Yeah, I think that's great. So let's bring Chris into the mix here. So for those that don't know, Chris Cravens is, I'm lucky to call him a great friend, as well as somebody who's been a huge part of supporting this process and writing alignment. And Chris, thank you so much for being a part of this entire journey and joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. It's been really fun to collaborate on the project and just see the progress as you two have put it together, and just to be there for the journey has been a pleasure.
Awesome.
So my question, and Jonathan, this goes back to something that you mentioned a few moments ago around that shift. It wasn't that we just decided to, oh, let's write a different book. It was those first 5 or 6 months of our collaboration, you were still actively, like really actively, like more intensely than I've ever seen anyone, pulling content from interviews. You were interviewing, this book pulls in voices from dozens of experts, and you were getting those interviews in real time. So I remember on a weekly basis, we would meet, we'd have a whole new load of information that was coming from people such as Chris and other folks out there in the industry. And so the question for both of you, and I just want to kind of leave it out there and have you guys run with it, is from a standpoint of a product development and strategic thinking at this level, could you talk a little bit about the difficulties or the challenges when you are on a path and you want to do one thing, and then the data or the content coming in and saying, no, actually what you want to do is this whole other thing. And where is that, what is that, what are those finer moments where you have to make those critical decisions and say, do I force the data to go where I want to go, or do I go with the data?
I'll always force the data. Goal seek, one of the best things in Excel. That's a great question. Excuse me. I think it's almost like when you talk to scientists who pursue a particular pet theory for a long period of time, right? You get an amount of attachment to a particular thing, and then as new data comes in, it can be challenging to integrate if there's dissonance between what that data tells you and what you already believe, it can be really difficult for humans to integrate that, just in general, right? And there's a lot of ego that gets tied up in the concept of no, I'm right, and this opinion that I've formed is right. There's a lot of baggage that goes along with that. So I mean, I think those kind of firmly held beliefs around values, I think, belong in agile digital teams and agile companies that need to be able to adapt and react to things quickly. Firmly held beliefs in particular tactical methods probably don't belong, right? So the how is going to change as you go. I don't know, John, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I completely agree with that. And I think, going through the writing process of this book and just trying to distill down all of the incredible insight and experiences from others as well, let alone my own experiences working on, hundreds of products for brands of, from startups to Fortune 100s, is this challenge of, as you said, ego, first we, and I think we have a really interesting thing that happens is people fall in love with ideas and they rarely fall in love with the problem anymore. And yet when we're, in the space of product, our job is to solve problems. We're problem solvers. And otherwise we wouldn't have products to create. And so the need for organizations to stop falling in love with the solution or an idea, or, as this idea of the highest paid person in the room's opinion is the one that matters the most. It's like, well, that has nothing to do with it. It's all comes down to setting that ego aside and really focusing on the problem at hand as a team. And I think that, in the dozens of interviews I did, our countless conversations that you and I went through in the research, the highest performing organizations with the most successful products literally built a team culture of putting that ego in check.
Right.
And so their biases were not getting in the way. They really started to confront, how do you effectively stay focused on the problem that you're solving? And that was transformational. And we went through that whole process in the book itself, when we, reoriented it and pivoted. And then, in its own way, the book found its own alignment because it fit now. The narrative was there. It just needed to be, distilled down in its essence. And I think, organizations need to do that for themselves as well.
I think that's extremely important to point out, right? And I love also that you started off with friction and went to alignment, because if you look at like just kind of the natural flow of things, at least from what I've seen in building things, you start off with a level of intent, and when you're really small, it's really easy. Well, it's easier, I should say. It's easier to align when you're small and you can pull everybody into a room and you just say, like, you can like call an audible, like, hey, we're going to push change to production, or hey, we're changing this product direction, or we're making that change, or we're going to go get more funding, or we're going to do this, right? Everybody's there where that communication just flows in a very simple way. And then as you start to achieve a level of success, you're penalized, right? And you start to branch out. And now these individual threads where you were able to govern that simply by shouting something over your shoulder, now your governance process has to be more evolved. And chances are you're probably resisting that, right?
Yeah.
So there's this balancing act of the friction definitely comes up, and everybody wants to deal with the friction, and it's like, oh, this hurts. What do I do?
Yeah.
Like, well, align.
It was, building on that, it was so interesting going through the process of realizing that alignment had to be completely redefined in this process. I mean, I think one of the most powerful and insightful things that I learned through the process of writing this book is how you had to focus on alignment at different levels, right? Mm-hmm. So when we went through the process and we talk about alignment now, it's completely different than how generally it was thought of 2 years ago starting the process, right? So this idea of individual alignment, which really is all about understanding how your work matters and how your contribution makes a difference in your organization and to the end people that use your product or service, or team alignment, which is all dealing with how you align the skills and competencies and experiences of your team to solve problems more effectively, or that of your organization, that there's organizational alignment that deals with aligning, reflecting your mission and your strategy and your objectives and your resources. And then there's that idea of market alignment or market fit, as most people, talk about it. But it's not one thing. You have to break it down into these smaller pieces to really be able to achieve it at the kind of scale that, we're talking about. And what's really interesting to me is when you talk about that team dynamic is that leaders that especially understand how to build products that can scale, that can drive, significant success, they never stop working on alignment. They're working on all 4 levels at all times.
That's right.
It's a lot.
That becomes the work. I mean, that's the real trick, right? When you reach a point, like, your job as an executive is no longer the execution.
Right.
You're going to govern the execution, right? But the end execution is your accountability, but not your responsibility. Your responsibility is alignment of all the teams who intersect, like every possible thread that's going to come through this world that you're building. It's your job. If you are the person in charge of building that thing, whether you know who that person is or not, whether they like you or not, whether you've ever met them, your job is to make sure that they're successful in consuming your product. Right? Absolutely. And that's the thing, right? And then from there, it's okay, now, and as you said, all 4 levels of alignment, that's your job, right? You north, south, east, west, all these different directions of how are you going to stitch this together And I love that there has been this evolution, and it's been fun to watch this kind of happen with um, the individual alignment to mission, right? And the individual alignment to outcome and customer satisfaction. And I think that is so critical, and something that honestly, like, we've been missing. Uh, and I've seen, the kind of difference between great shops and okay shops, I think, is partly that, right? There's a lot of things, but when you talk to people who work for places that they really love and you ask them why, there's always this connection, this like, hey, I feel like I'm connected to the work. I understand how what I'm doing is moving the needle. I feel like I'm compensated fairly. I feel like I'm challenged and I know what's next. Those are all alignment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It was really interesting. One of the areas of research that kind of unfolded naturally was starting to dive into neuroscience. And so I had the great opportunity to interview, through the process of the book, Dan Cable, who's one of the world's leading neuroscientists. He's published multiple books through Harvard Business Review. He teaches at the London Business School, where we met. And he wrote a book called Alive at Work, which touches on exactly what you're talking about, that idea of purpose, but how purpose drives performance, and how this idea of alignment is not just a psychological need, but it's actually biological. It's built into who we are as people, that we seek alignment, this idea of cause and effect. And leaders, really, this is such an untapped area of opportunity in their organizations, and to understand that, because it shifts you from this why me to why we, right? Once you can start building again, it's like, why are we doing this? How do we as a community and as a group create this change or deliver this product? And is it something that we all can believe in? Because everybody obviously has a choice, to decide where they want to work and what products they create. So this is, that clarity becomes incredibly empowering to teams. I'm curious, from your perspective, I mean, you've worked at startups and, global scale, on some of the biggest products around. I'm curious how that aspect you've experienced that in your own leadership, and in seeing both where senior leaders maybe and emerging leaders have either succeeded or even failed.
Yeah, I think so much of success or failure ties directly to a leader's ability to engage and align the team. And it is along those multiple levels. It is in, first off, creating kind of a sense of identity. And then out of that, you can start to build a sense of purpose. And the sense of purpose then starts to align to actual tangible outcomes and things that matter, right? And you start to then tie that thread of, here's how this team is contributing, right? And really doing the work to break it down so that those contributions are very clear. It involves a lot of communication that traverses multiple levels, right? Part of your job as a leader, you have to be able to manage up, manage out, 100%, which means you are constantly informing the executive staff as to what you're doing. You're constantly aligning and syncing with your peers so that you're having that discussion of, what do I need from you? What do you need from me? What's our horse trading? What are our shared commitments? And hopefully within that as well, you're also aligning teams so that where you have shared accountability, you have an executive alignment, you have alignment on MBOs, on compensation, on success criteria, so things are owned equally through that, right? But there is this art of creating the horizontal alignment and managing expectations, and then replicating that or communicating that vertically through the organization, so that you inform your stakeholders and you bring along all of your staff. And there's an art to that of kind of meeting in the middle. It goes back to the goal seeking thing. And, do you force it? Do you force the data, or do you, let the data drive you? And it's kind of both, right? And it's the same kind of thing when coming up with this, where as the leader, you have to provide an amount of structure, But if you dominate the conversation, you will not get anything of real value because people won't be bought in. It's your thing. And the temptation so much of the time as new leaders is, I'm going to make this happen. So I stay up all night and I create slides, and then I tell people, and I'm guilty of this. I did this in my early days. And I know a lot of people. I coached several CIOs. I was coaching someone earlier today who's a very senior CIO, and they're doing exactly this. Like, hey, did you notice? Right? You've got to then, if you want the alignment, you've got to get buy-in. If you want buy-in, you've got to have conversations.
Yeah.
And that then becomes the real thing of, how do you then, as much effort as you're putting into managing up and out, it's all really good. It has to happen. A lot of people prioritize that, and you have to be successful. You should be spending the same amount of time surfacing things from your folks, getting their buy-in, building trust. That's where the alignment really comes. It's not from just pushing it out to them and saying, this is life, enjoy.
Absolutely. I know another thing that came up, through the process of writing the book was this issue of, failure. And failure comes up so often. And normally when you do your, first pass at research, you find that, everybody says, well, products failed because there wasn't market fit. Like, that's kind of the easy out answer.
Yeah.
I'll put it out there to say that. In some cases, it's true, right? They just didn't know their customer well, and that is a legitimate thing. Again, goes back to falling in love with your solution or your idea versus really understanding the problem, and is it a problem that people want to have solved, or is it worth switching to your solution? But what's most interesting to me was the actual issue of internal sabotage. So this idea that, because we're not working on alignment, we're not confronting head on the things that are creating barriers to our success, we are literally sabotaging the opportunity to deliver a great product or service. And big organizations can kind of muscle their way through that, right? They have enough money, enough resources, they've, have maybe brand recognition, and so they can kind of get by with some of that. But if you're a startup or an early stage company, that can be the end of the organization. That sabotage and that misalignment that happens so often, and it's funny to think about that when you think about what leaders now need to understand differently about what it takes to actually successfully navigate the complexity of going through product transformation. And it seems like, if we look at just what's happened in the last year and a half, I mean, we've seen, digital transformation spend is increased by 300%. So it's not, it's only accelerating, it's not going away. So what would you tell a senior leader today, somebody you might be coaching, or somebody that, like, when you have to be, a student of failure to navigate that complexity, what's one of the biggest takeaways you think they need to keep in mind if they're going to build alignment?
I think there's a couple of things. So first off, separate the concept of idea from execution, right? Because those are two separate dimensions that you have to be able to look at. And then the third thing, and this is a little bit of a newer thing for me, is like, distance yourself from the emotional impact of it. I mean, if there's one bit of advice I can give to anybody, is don't get hung up. Like, don't hang your own value or your team's value on whether or not you succeed or fail. It really doesn't matter. Success is the eventual destination after repeated failure, really. Now, within that, there are choices that you can make that will either take you to success or take you to failure. Pivots are a great thing. Being aware, and again, it comes down to, what is the actual failure? Is it an idea failure, or is it an execution failure? So let's talk about that for a second. So idea thing, like, is the thing that you wish to do in the market viable? Is it something that the market will buy and that people are going to give a crap about and put money into? That's the first thing. The second thing is, if you are fortunate enough to find one of those, did you build it at the right time, in the right way, and market it and get enough people to it where you're successful. And that's execution, you know, and you have to line up both of those. You know, we hear all these success stories. We hear about things, and I've been part of some of these companies, like, you know, Uber taking off and becoming a massive success, or the rise of social gaming and Zynga becoming a household name. All of a sudden, everybody's doing Phil and all this stuff, right? For every one of those, there are several 100,000 startups that are not doing anything, right? We don't think about those. We think about the ones that take off. You know, the same way, like when, you know, I don't know, I'm relating to my own experience. When I was a kid and I picked up my first electric guitar, I assumed that I would become a rock star. You know, I did not assume that at some point I would be middle-aged and be very happy to sit, like, just playing an acoustic guitar in the mornings and playing like 12-bar blues. You know, in the same way, like, we don't set out with the intent of like, yeah, I think I'm going to do okay with this. We set out because we're going to do some massive transformation or build some massive product or build some massive thing. So that's cool. Just be thoughtful about it. Like, don't get hung up on it. Realize, like, there's no way I was going to go be a rock star guitar player if I didn't go and nail the fundamentals and learn, like, geez, what is the major scale? How does harmony? You know, that's the alignment work. That's doing the work. The same way when you want to build a company or build a thing, you got to go in and figure out, what are your fundamentals? How do you get people to align the right way? How do you get them talking? Who's responsible for what? What do they own? You know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you touched on two things that I want to highlight for everybody listening and watching today. Is the first is, you know, that separation that you talked about from the, you know, the idea and the execution. I mean, this is something I've seen countless times in the work that I've done, whether it's, you know, working with senior leaders or working with product teams hands-on that we do, and also through the research in the book. It's just amazing. And on the first part, you know, what was a glaring that became something, almost became its own separate book, actually. And even Dave can talk about this, because we went back and forth with, you know, hundreds of pages up on a big wall. You know, it's like, where do we take this? How far are we going to go with this idea of strategy? You know, it's like, and that concept these days is such a buzzword, and it's so misunderstood across industries and across organizations. And you realize that leapfrog that people make, they jump into execution or they jump into things, is because they don't understand, they misconstrue goals or planning as strategy.
Right.
And they start leaping into this idea of, you know, then dangerous mantras like fail fast, fail often, which, if properly understood, is an incredible asset, but when misunderstood, especially at a management level, can be extremely catastrophic for an organization. Because the idea is not to have failed products, but experiments that help you, you know, create micro adjustments so you can navigate, you know, those waters. And every single person interviewed for this project, as well as the countless hours of research, pointed to, you know, that shared understanding, which is its own topic in a second that we'll get into. But I think there's this idea here that is so important that you're highlighting, is that when you understand those differences, is that you can't leapfrog, because the foundation that comes from true strategy is actually what makes successful execution even possible.
That's right. That's right. So I think it's the combination of true strategy, and out of true strategy, you can align and you can define the bare minimum governance and foundation that's necessary to be able to really open people up and allow them to innovate.
I mean, this is one of the things that I think inspired me the most about writing this book, is just seeing so many great people and great ideas and teams just fail, honestly. You know, just stumbling through, you know, when you have an industry like, you know, tech that moves so quickly and so fast, and yet the people involved are brilliant. I mean, and it's just, I'm constantly in awe of, you know, people that we work with and people that I meet in this industry. Yet there's just some of these kind of foundational underpinnings that, if they were in place, they could just absolutely, just take off, and they'd be at an entirely different level of success. And that was such a huge part for me of when you witness that high performance aligned team and organization. It's like contagious. Like, you just want to keep working. You just want to be a part
Oh
of it,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And then
And it
all of a
really is
sudden,
something to behold, where it's like, it's just,
yeah,
they're off, right? And I've seen that so many times as people, like, I mean, just having a network, and it is, you're building your relationships with folks. And I'd see people swap in and out of companies and join different teams. And I would see the same thing within my own teams, and how a team dynamic all of a sudden was different. And because that team was a different group of individual humans, they all of a sudden could do something different. And it was down to that.
yeah.
Their
I
alignment.
mean, it's
Right?
it's
It was
true
more
rocket
organic.
fuel. It's
Yeah.
alignment. It takes things to a totally different level. It's unbelievable.
Well, it takes you from the position, like, think about this, like, we all talk about the concept of the no look pass, right? And the idea is that the no look pass is something that occurs organically. And that when you spend enough time working with somebody, you spend enough time, or you look at actual sports, right? You run drills again and again and again and again, where that person is going to be. That's trust, that's predictability, right? Is knowing how somebody is going to behave. In a work context, that develops over time, but you can accelerate the development of no looks by really setting crisp structure around alignment, ownership, right? And then how you measure outcomes.
Right.
And that part's critical, right? Especially when you're thinking about having multiple teams who are responsible for a shared objective. If you have different if you have different objectives and different MBOs and different success criteria for each of the leaders at a peer level, you're going to have problems, right? I mean, it's really like, it is a true way of life to get into this. And great alignment becomes the counter to all things politics. All things politics really becomes like, what is it that somebody wishes to do that may not be directly aligned to the best outcome of the greater good, but rather aligned to their own?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we saw a lot of this too in just doing a lot of research on high performance teams in and outside of the tech space. I mean,
Yeah.
that idea of, the common thing is, what makes somebody elite or a master at what they do is they've practiced the fundamentals, where it's unconscious mastery of those skills, whether they're a great designer or an engineer or a strategist or a critical thinker, or it doesn't matter what field you're in. It's common. You see it in every sport as well, and in so many other areas. And I think what was also really interesting, and you and I have talked a lot about this in other conversations, is like alignment needs to become one of those fundamental unconscious skills, where it's a piece of mastery that is in the way that you manage it, so you can effectively lead and execute great products.
Yes. Yeah, and it has to become something like, if you look at the way that teams align today, right? Look at like your annual planning process, right? So for any leader that's out there, if you want to get started on this and you really want to start to understand, like, where are you really? When you finish your annual process, retrospect, and look at how long did it take you to get to that? Like, how long does it take you to come up with a plan? I've been places where we spent 8 months out of the year coming up with a plan. And then we talk about being agile. That doesn't work. It doesn't work at all, right? So the key to being able to move with agility, the faster you want to go, the faster you need to go, the more you need the ability for individual functions to be autonomous. For them to be autonomous and move with speed and not end up in totally random places or cratered in your business, that's where alignment comes in, right? To truly unlock that at speed, right? And that's when you do get into that challenge of, You know, and building a product, building a company, building a team, anything where you're going through significant change, it doesn't really matter. It's all hard, right? And the work is similar, just on different scales with different levels of rigor to make the fundamentals work, right? But the challenge is still the same of first in like building a car, and then while you're driving it at high speed down the road, finishing it, then transforming it into a jet plane and taking off without ever slowing down. You know, while picking up more people along the ride and adding more humans, adding more capability, adding customers, like all of these things kind of happen along the way if you're successful.
Yep, absolutely. Just looking at time here, I wanted to check in, Dave. Do we have some questions that are starting to roll in here?
We do have a critical question from one of our guests wants to know, Jonathan, with regards to the book, is there going to be a director's cut that all the material that we left on the floor is going to be, you know, the 500-page version is going to come out in you know, a year to 18 months from now. Is that how are you doing with your next project?
Well, that's a wait and see. We just finished this one, so I might take a little bit of a breather, but you know, I mean, gosh, I can't even imagine how many pages of content we have sitting there that we had to pull out of the book to keep it focused. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's another book in the future, but I'm not going to commit to anything right now.
I have a question also, and I'll toss this out to the both of you. It's directed toward Chris, but I think I would love to hear both of your thoughts on this. Is having been active leaders, and Chris, it's your highly successful and fast-moving companies. What are some of the most common challenges that either of you have encountered throughout leading different product teams over time, and whether it's that could be a recent challenge, something from the archives, but definitely curious to hear that, you know, real world kind of stuff.
So my big real world one, it kind of comes back to as you're moving quickly, you tend to shortcut conversations, and it can be really easy to make quick decisions about product direction, feature, team alignment, services, something. Pick a thing. It doesn't matter what thing. It can be really common to have a quick discussion where you kind of believe that things are well set up, and maybe you define some quick success criteria and go forward. Oftentimes, those quick conversations turn into longer conversations down the road of clarifying and reclarifying what was it that we were actually trying to do. You know, so I think as much as possible, be really explicit up front to enable yourself to go fast. Take a little bit of extra time up front. You know, slow is smooth, smooth is fast. Define up front, what is it that you want to do? What are our guardrails? What does success really look like? And success never looks like I'm going to do a thing, right? I'm going to write code. I'm going to implement a feature. I'm going to do this. It's that thing is going to yield X results, right? And something that's measurable against some kind of state change. Yeah, John, what do you think?
I mean, spot on. I've had that very similar experiences with teams. The thing that I would also just add to that is, you know, when you're having those conversations, you know, what I find is this assumption that's so easy to make that we have a common understanding of something. So as an example, I run into this all the time, is that there's, you know, we talk about every organization kind of has their shorthand and their little acronyms and lingos, and you know, but when we talk about as an industry, right, we talk about something like agile, or we talk about customer experience. This is something that we have a sense of what it is, but that doesn't mean we have a shared understanding. So having a common language versus a shared understanding are two very different things that are intimately related.
Right.
And the highest performing organizations and teams really are great about understanding in the beginning, we've got to make sure that we have a shared understanding, that we understand when somebody in the room is talking about customer experience, let's say I've got 5 people in a room, that every single person in that room knows at that organization or as in that group what they mean by customer experience.
Mm-hmm.
You know, for designers, that's very different than engineers potentially, or very different than, you know, what an executive is thinking about potentially. And so we have to make sure that that shared understanding is really clear. That clarity and you know, brings incredible focus for teams. And I've experienced this in a lot of different ways. A couple of years ago, I was working on one particular project where, you know, just that lack of common understanding just kept creating this kind of circular process where teams just kept having to do rework again and again and again and again. And they couldn't, because they were in the work instead of coming from the outside, they couldn't see why they were stuck in kind of this cycle where they could never get to outcomes. And because they kept, you know, they didn't have the shared understanding and couldn't set those outcomes that you were talking about. And I've seen this, you know, multiple times, but, you know, that particular client it just, you know, it's burned into my brain because it was happening at such scale. And it was really detrimental to their ability to drive impact.
You know, Chris, a couple times, and this is related to what you guys just shared, and you mentioned earlier. So earlier you talked about you have to, and Jonathan, you and I have also talked about this notion of sometimes you have to go slow to go fast, and then Chris, you meant this came up earlier in the conversation. I was wondering to sort of parlay that back to this concept Jonathan and I talked quite a bit about during this process, is the kind of the fallacy of urgency, or the you know, how that sort of, and this earlier you were talking about how that relates to a leader's ability to have those conversations early, you know, to have moments with people, to get that buy-in, to get to tie the group mission to the individual process. That's a bit of a jambalaya of a question, but I'm curious about that notion of like working slow, dealing with urgency, whether it's from the market or whatever, and then seeing the long, you know, playing the long game.
Yeah, that's a great question. So very few good things come from rushing, right? It's kind of the thought. And it oftentimes is that you're able to, well, first off, generally as human beings, we're going to make a better decision if we're responding to something rather than reacting to something. So if you're reacting to something, you are generally not putting a whole lot of thought into it. It's, you know, it's a reaction. Somebody throws something at you, you're going to put your hand up. It's a reaction. Your response, somebody throws something at you and you know, turn around and say, hey, please don't throw things at me, right? It's slightly different. There's extra thought process in there. So I think that becomes critical in thinking, like, how do we think things through? So one of the great tools that I got along the way was from Mark Pincus. And he would talk about ruthless prioritization. And ruthless prioritization is a way that you can still get things done and go fast. And the way that you go fast is by focusing on the things that really, really matter and only doing those. And the other things that are noise, you don't do. Now, the hard part there becomes in defining what is truly important and what is noise. And the more expectations there are hanging on each of those things, the harder those conversations become. But this is just kind of cadence level conversations, right? And this is where never letting yourself get behind the 8 ball becomes important, which means it's never too late to start. So start now. You know, every single leader out there, if they're saying like, oh man, I'm not doing this. I feel a little overwhelmed. Go schedule a meeting with your team and figure out what the heck they're working on and who they're working on it for and why. And then go talk to those folks. Just start the process. You know, there's no magic to it. It's just a thing. And it's only hard until it isn't.
Yeah, building that process of prioritization, I found as well, is just absolutely essential. And if it depends what what hat you have to wear at what time too. So I think about, like, if you're responsible for the experience of a product, know which moments matter most. What are the jobs of that product that need to be fulfilled in order for a customer to be satisfied, to have their needs met. There's a lot of features that get built that have little to no value. So that's not
Right.
necessarily what's important. If you need to go fast,
Right.
focus on the value creation. And I know this is something that you and I have talked quite a bit about, Chris, is that this idea of the most important thing when you look at value is you have to look at it. It's two sides of the same coin that you have to look at, which is there's value for the end customer or user, and there's value to the business. If there's not an equitable exchange, why are you investing into it? You have to understand what the outcome is related to that exchange, and that value exchange is just something that you have to spend a lot of time, and it's all in the details. And so
yeah,
if
it's
you want to move
absolutely
fast,
in the
focus
details.
that.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, right, so if you don't get into the details, then you have problems later, and this is where the friction comes up. So a little bit more upfront effort to get into the details and really understand, as opposed to, like, let's say the three of us get on a phone call or a Zoom, and we say, all right, we're going to do some stuff. And then I think I know what that means, and you think you know what it means, and Dave thinks he knows what it means. And we all go in. 2 weeks later, we come back, and stuff that I did does not line up with the stuff that Dave did or that you did. And we're all kind of looking at each other going, like, what the F? What happened? Okay, well, let's back up. Let's do some stuff. John, my sense is you provide these two things. Dave, you provide these two things. I provide these two things. Now we discuss, we align, we agree. Now we have clear expectations. We are responding rather than reacting to stimulus.
I think I heard this great story once, and it was all about how do you make sure that there's that shared understanding. And I loved how simple the solution was to it, is just asking the other person or people that you're working with, just, what did you hear?
Mm-hmm.
That's not a confrontational question. It's just an honest question. And it's so simple a solution to start building alignment in the simplest way, super quick, with anybody that you're collaborating with, is, well, I said this, but what did you hear? Right.
So similarly, I love to have things, if teams are, especially when relationships are contentious between a couple of teams that have to be able to work together, I have them pitch the other one's perspective. Especially if it's down to a thing of like two teams that have opposing solutions for something and they have to come to an agreement. I'll have them each go off and do the work, like, make your case, come back to me, like, give me a 6-slide presentation. And you're going to come back and give it to me. And then, the next thing is, by the way, you're going to present each other's views. So I want you to spend the time to get to know where they're coming from and get to know each other's arguments. And very rarely do I actually have to have the presentation where they're fighting it out still. What they usually ends up happening is they come together and they say, we came up with something.
Yeah. That's a great, that sounds like Jedi mind tricks right there, Chris. That's yeah, I love that idea. I want to jump in because we have a couple of comments in the chat, and I'm just going to start with the first one that came in. And I'm just going to parse through it because it talks about, it mentions the process of what we discussed around writing the book, but how in order to get into alignment, we stayed focused on the problem in order to arrive at the successful execution. So I want to throw that out to the both of you. So not only obviously the importance of staying focused on the problem, but when something has long legs to it, what about the challenges of, like, a team going through inertia, going through fatigue, and how important it is to stay focused on the problem?
Like when you get into the trough of disillusionment.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, I
yeah.
think that's always it, right?
Yes.
Is just I'll just, my quick thing on this is, if you stay focused on the problem, you make the problem your true north, and you always come back to what is our purpose, right? What is our true north? And that's gonna, you know, what you do to get there will evolve over time, but the thing that you're trying to solve remains the same, right? It's like, you know, your vision versus your mission.
Yeah, I think Chris said it perfectly. You know, I think what a lot of times too that's really helpful, and actually, Chris, you and I used to do this a lot when we were working on products together, is this idea of, you know, here's the big challenge, you know, the macro picture, and then we would break it down into the small bite-sized digestible pieces and then go, okay, well,
That's
if
it.
these are the
Yeah.
barriers to solving this bigger challenge, you know, then out of these, what are the things that we have to prioritize and actually to move the needle forward? Because a lot of times you're working in an organization where you've got to show proof of value. You've got to show them that, hey, we are making a difference, but we need to get a little bit further and a little bit further. And every stepping stone is part of solving that bigger challenge. And I think that the people get stuck on the macro picture, and that diagnosis of understanding all of the smaller pieces become essential. That is just, you're giving a gift to the team when it comes to execution there. You're making their job possible because you're also asking them to solve the problems then in digestible, measurable ways that tee them up for success. You're driving empowerment, which is really, really
Right.
key.
Right. I think there's definitely a trick to how you do that across an organization, right? But you're right. You're driving that empowerment that becomes beneficial, and it becomes a multiplying factor for your org.
I'd like to get, if we could get to one more and then sort of do a little send off. The question is, how does one deal with the unknown unknowns in this framework and the places where further details might not be possible at the current moment? I love that question.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Chris, you want to take that, or you want me to jump in?
Why don't you start this time?
Okay. I think this comes down to two things can commonly come up in this scenario. One is you're in execution, maybe already, of a product, and you realize that your strategy is actually incomplete or inadequate. And so we talk about the process of diagnosis a lot in the book. And this is an issue that the teams deal with all the time. They're far enough down the road and they realize, well, did we actually understand who our core audience was for this? Did we actually do the diagnosis of the challenge? Did we ever define the outcomes? Did we give measures that actually the team controls? A really quick example on that is, you know, this idea of like, okay, I'm going to build a product and the team now is responsible for net promoter score. Well, I can't stand net promoter score, and here's the reason why. Because a product team is, unless they own the entire customer experience, is only owns a piece of that score. It's a cumulative thing of the entire experience of a customer and their interactions with an organization. So it's a grossly horrible measure of product performance. You need to focus on the tasks, the value exchange points of a product. And so that's one scenario if you don't know what you don't know, and then that guides you to go backwards, and you're going to have to do that. In the other side of it, ambiguity is just part of the game when it comes to product development. There's always going to be some of that. If you've done the due diligence and you have a strong strategic foundation, what you do is you've created yourself a decision framework. You've created a way to take going from broad sets of information, where when it's codified, you're moving from information to intelligence. And that means you can drive smart decision making around ambiguity and those things that you cannot control. And you can start to make sure that you're making the best decisions that you're capable of in that moment.
Yeah, I like your point about ambiguity, right? I see a lot of this as the calm and systematic removal of ambiguity and replacement of that with clear direction and expectations, right? So that gives them like a good sense, like if you are, as a leader, if you are contributing to the calm and rational clarification of that ambiguity, you're doing good things. You may like get to the right results, but you're not going to get there gracefully if you're like whooping people up into a lather, right? It's like, remember, part of the goal here is to remind folks it's going to be okay. We're all making the best decisions we can. It's going to be okay, and we're going to get there.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I think with that, we're pretty much at time here for the day. First off, Chris, Dave, thank you so much for joining me today and being such a huge part of this journey. And thank you for making this event so special. I always love these conversations. Thank you to everybody who participated and all of your wonderful questions. I know there was a few that we didn't get to, but for time's sake, ping me over LinkedIn or send me an email. I'd be happy to answer those one-on-one if you like. And please go check out the book, Alignment. It's available now on Amazon and Apple. We would love for you to get a copy and to have your support. And I also just, again, want to thank then all of the people who've been involved in the project, from all of those who've been interviewed, helped us through the writing process and the peer reviews and all of this incredible work, especially with everything else going on in the world in the last year and a half. It's been incredible, and I am so grateful for all of you. With that, guys, do you have any closing words you want to share before we wrap it up?
Just grateful to have been along for the journey and watch. This is absolutely huge. I'm really proud of you guys for putting this out. This is a great resource. Thank you.
Yeah, I also just want to just send a thank you. It was not only working with you, Jonathan, but then being able to immerse myself in the interviews with people such as Chris, and I feel like I got to know people who are out there doing great things. So thanks for making me a part of it.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys again so much. I really appreciate you. Thank you everybody for joining, and reach out if you ever have any questions and we can help.